What would you do if 3 women you once saved came back a decade later and asked you to marry them 10 years ago in the burning silence of the South Dakota Badlands? A lone cowboy risked his life to rescue 3 Lakota women from certain death. He never asked for thanks. He never expected to see them again. But some promises don't fade with time, and some debts are carried in the heart, not the hands. Now they have returned stronger, wiser, and carrying a proposal that could change his life forever. The question is, what kind of answer could possibly shock them all before we dive in? Let us know where you're watching from. Let me tell you how it began. The sun hung mercilessly over the South Dakota Badlands, pouring heat down onto the red rock formations like molten fire. The wind moved in long, dry breaths, carrying dust across the endless stretch of yellowed grass. It was the kind of silence that swallowed sound, the kind that made a man feel small against the land. A lone cowboy rode through it, his silhouette stretched long across the ground. His horse, a strong bay with a dark mane, moved steadily beneath him, each hoofbeat echoing faintly in the emptiness. He didn't rush. He never did. There was nowhere he needed to be, and no one waiting for him at the end of the road. He was a man who had learned to move through the world without leaving a mark. He didn't ask questions, didn't interfere, didn't look too closely at trouble that didn't belong to him. Life had taught him that much. Trouble had a way of pulling you in deeper than you intended, and people had a way of disappearing when you needed them most. So he kept to himself. The heat shimmered on the horizon, bending the distant hills into wavering shapes. The only sound was the soft creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hooves against dry earth. Then the silence broke. A scream tore through the air. It was sharp, sudden, and filled with something unmistakable fear. The horse stopped mid-step, its ears snapping forward. The cowboy lifted his head, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward the sound. For a moment, everything stilled again, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Then it came again. Another scream, louder this time. Not laughter, not play, a cry for help. He shifted in the saddle, scanning the horizon. In the distance, a rising cloud of dust twisted upward into the sky. Something was moving fast. He felt the old instinct tug at him, the one that said, "Keep riding, keep your head down, keep out of it." He could turn away now, pretend he hadn't heard it. No one would blame him. No one would even know. But the third scream came raw and desperate, cutting straight through whatever hesitation remained. His jaw tightened. For a split second, he didn't move. Then he pulled hard on the reins, turning the horse in a sharp arc. His heel pressed into its side, and the animal surged forward, kicking up dust as they raced toward the sound. The land opened up before him, revealing the source of the chaos. 3 women were running across the open grass, their figures small against the vast landscape. Their dresses, soft buckskin adorned with beadwork, fluttered wildly as they moved, long braided hair whipping behind them. They ran like their lives depended on it. Because they did. Behind them, a group of riders thundered across the plains. Armed men, mercenaries by the look of them, shouted as they closed the distance, firing shots into the air to drive their prey forward like hunted animals. The gap between them was shrinking fast. One of the women stumbled, falling hard onto the ground. For a heartbeat, it looked like she wouldn't get back up. Then she did. She pushed herself forward, forcing her legs to move again, refusing to fall behind. The cowboy felt something tighten in his chest. If those men caught them, it wouldn't end well. It wouldn't end at all. His father's voice echoed faintly in his memory. Don't get involved in things that aren't yours. He had lived by that rule for years. But rules had a way of breaking when faced with something like this. He leaned forward in the saddle. "Damn it," he muttered. Then he rode straight into the storm. As he approached, he raised his voice, shouting over the thunder of hooves. "Hey, over here." The women turned their faces streaked with sweat and dust, eyes wide with fear and suspicion. He knew that look. A stranger on horseback wasn't always salvation. He reached for the only words he knew, the broken fragments of Lakota he had picked up in trading posts and passing conversations. "Trust me, ride," they hesitated. Behind them, the gunshots grew louder. One of the riders shouted something crude, urging his horse faster. Time ran out. One of the women made the decision. She veered toward him, sprinting with everything she had left. As he slowed just enough, she grabbed onto his arm and swung herself up behind him with surprising strength. The other two didn't follow. They turned instead, heading toward a cluster of jagged rock formations rising from the earth ahead. He understood instantly. 3 people on one horse wouldn't make it. He pulled the reins sharply, turning away from the rocks and kicking his horse into a full gallop in the opposite direction. "Hold on," he said. The woman behind him didn't answer. Her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, steady and silent. The riders behind them split into 2 groups. Most followed him. Good. That was the point. He made sure of it, leaning low and guiding his horse across open ground where the dust would rise thick and obvious. He wanted them chasing him. The wind roared in his ears as the chase began in earnest. The terrain shifted quickly, smooth plains giving way to uneven ground littered with rocks and dry brush. Branches clawed at his coat, tearing at the fabric. The horse beneath him pushed harder, muscles straining, breath coming in heavy bursts. A shot rang out. He felt the bullet slice past his shoulder, close enough to stir the air. "Keep moving," he murmured, more to the horse than to himself. He angled toward a narrow stretch of stone ahead, a place he knew well enough from past travels. If he could reach it, 2 riders were gaining on him. Too close. The woman behind him shifted suddenly. Before he could react, she let go. "What are you doing?" he snapped, pulling the reins slightly. She dropped to the ground, grabbing a rock and hurling it toward the nearest rider. It struck the man's shoulder, throwing him off balance just enough to slow him down. "Go!" he shouted. She didn't move. She stood there facing the danger with a steadiness that surprised him. For a brief moment, their eyes met, really met for the first time. There was no fear in hers, only decision. She wasn't running. She was staying. Something in him shifted. He grabbed her arm, hauling her back up onto the horse just as another shot rang out. They pushed forward, entering the narrow passage between towering stone walls. The sound of hooves echoed violently around them, magnified in the confined space. It felt like being chased inside a drum. He pushed deeper. Then the path ended. A solid wall of rock rose in front of them. No way forward. The horse skidded to a halt, backing up, snorting in panic. Behind them, the riders were closing in. No time. No options. The woman slid off the horse, standing beside him. Her breathing was steady, controlled. She looked at him and said quietly, "If we die, we die together." No trembling, no tears, just acceptance. He stared at her for a fraction of a second. Then something clicked. There, to the left, a narrow crack in the rock, barely visible, just wide enough. He grabbed the reins, turning the horse sharply. "Trust me," he said again, but this time his voice was lower, certain. He pushed the horse forward. The animal hesitated for only a second before squeezing into the tight gap stones, scraping against its sides. The cowboy leaned low, pulling the woman with him as they forced their way through. Gunshots exploded behind them. A bullet struck the rock, sending fragments flying. Then they were through. On the other side, the passage opened again into a hidden stretch of land. The riders behind them pulled up short. Their horses were too large, the gap too narrow. They shouted in frustration, but it didn't matter. The chase was over. For now. A few moments later, the other 2 women emerged from the rocks nearby, breathless but alive. They ran toward each other, embracing tightly. Relief broke through the tension like rain after drought. Then they turned to him. Their eyes had changed. The fear was gone. In its place was something else, something deeper. Gratitude, respect, recognition. One of them, the one who had stayed, stepped forward. "We will find you again," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. "You won't," he replied simply. They asked his name. He gave it nothing more. No stories, no explanations. Then they turned and rode north, their figures growing smaller against the horizon, until they disappeared completely. The land swallowed them. The wind returned. The silence settled back into place. He stood there for a long moment, alone once more. The dust slowly drifted down, erasing the tracks of the chase. He told himself it was over, that they would forget, that people always did. He turned his horse, guiding it back toward the empty stretch of land he called his path. But as he rode away, he couldn't quite shake the memory of her voice. "We will find you again." He didn't believe it. Not then. Not yet. Will they ever meet again? Or was that moment meant to be their last? Tell me what you think in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. And don't forget to subscribe before we dive into the most powerful part of the story. 10 years passed. Time did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly like dust over the Badlands, covering what had once felt sharp and immediate, until it became something distant, almost imagined. The memory of that day, the chase, the gunfire, the promise whispered between life and death faded into something quieter. Not gone, but buried. Ethan Cole no longer rode without direction. He had built something. A small ranch stood a few miles from the nearest town, surrounded by rough wooden fences and long stretches of windswept grass. The land was not generous, but it was enough. A modest cabin sat at its center, sturdy and practical, built by his own hands. The walls held. The roof didn't leak. The door closed tight against the wind. It was everything a man needed, and nothing more. Ethan himself had changed in the way the land changes a man slowly, without permission. His shoulders had broadened, his movements more deliberate. Lines had formed around his eyes, not from laughter, but from years of looking into the distance, searching for nothing in particular. No one in the area knew the full story of how he came to live there, and he never offered it. The past was something he carried quietly. Even the words, "We will find you again," had long since lost their weight. They lingered like a half-forgotten dream, something that made less sense the more you tried to remember it. Life had settled into a pattern. He woke before the sun every day without exception. The sky would still be a deep gray blue when he stepped outside, the air cold enough to bite at his lungs. He would move through the morning without hurry, feeding the horses, checking the fences, making sure the well still held. By the time the sun rose, he was already working. Midday brought heat, the same relentless heat that baked the Badlands year after year. Sweat soaked through his shirt as he hammered posts into the ground-mended broken rails or walked the edges of his land eyes, scanning for anything out of place. There was always something to fix, always something to maintain. The work never ended, and that was the point. Evenings were the quietest. He would sit at the small wooden table inside his cabin, a single lantern casting soft light across the room. A plate, a cup, a spoon. The sounds were small metal against ceramic, the faint creak of wood, but in the silence they felt louder than they should. There was no conversation, no laughter, just the steady rhythm of a man existing within his own space. Sometimes, without realizing it, he would pause mid-meal and glance toward the door or the window as if expecting something or someone. Then he would shake his head as though correcting a mistake. He didn't wait for anyone. He had learned not to. The lessons had come early. His parents had died when he was still a boy, taken by sickness that moved through their town without mercy. One week they were there, the next they were gone. There had been no warning, no chance to say goodbye in any meaningful way. After that, he had learned to keep moving. Years later, there had been a woman. Not a wife, not quite, but close enough that it had mattered. She had wanted something from him. A promise. A future. A reason to stay. He had given her silence, and she had left. Not out of anger, not even out of disappointment, just absence. One day she was there, the next she wasn't. That had been enough. From those 2 losses, Ethan had built a rule so simple it felt like truth. If you let people close, you lose them. So he stopped letting them in. He didn't make enemies. He didn't push people away harshly. He simply kept a distance, a quiet, steady line no one was allowed to cross. It was easier that way. Safer. The only people who came close to that line were the Martinez family. Their ranch sat a few miles to the east, smaller than his, but filled with something his lacked life. Don Roberto, his wife Carmela, and their young daughter Rosa lived there along with Rosa's grandmother Lucia. They were warm people. Too warm sometimes. They would invite him for meals, insist he stay longer than he intended. Carmela would cook more than necessary, and Roberto would talk about the land as if it were a living thing. Ethan would listen, nod, help where he could. He repaired their fences when storms tore them down. He helped dig out their well when it ran dry. He never asked for payment. Rosa, in particular, watched him with wide, admiring eyes. To her, he was something more than just a neighbor. A hero. He never corrected her. But he never encouraged it either. He kept things simple. He helped, and then he left. That was the balance he allowed himself. Nothing deeper, nothing permanent. It worked. Until the day it didn't. The afternoon had been like any other, hot, quiet, predictable. Ethan was near the edge of his property, driving a post into the ground when he saw the dust. At first, it was just a faint disturbance on the horizon. Then it grew moving fast, uneven. A rider. He set the hammer down slowly, his eyes narrowing. As the figure drew closer, he recognized the small frame, the way the rider leaned forward in urgency. Rosa. She was riding too fast, too recklessly. Something was wrong. By the time she reached him, her horse was nearly spent foam gathering at its mouth. She barely managed to pull the reins before sliding down, stumbling as her feet hit the ground. "Ethan," she cried, her voice breaking. They took her. He stepped forward, steadying her. "Who, my grandmother?" she gasped. "Men. They came. They wanted the horses. Papa said no, and they—" Her words tangled in panic. They took her. They said if we don't give them all the horses by tomorrow. She couldn't finish. She didn't need to. Ethan's expression changed. The hesitation that might have existed in another man wasn't there. Which way, he asked. She pointed west, her hand trembling. That way. I saw them go. He nodded once. That was enough. He didn't waste time with comfort or reassurance. He helped her steady herself, then turned toward his cabin. Inside, he moved quickly. Rifle, rope, canteen. No extra weight, no unnecessary tools. He stepped back outside, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. Rosa looked at him with desperate hope. "You'll bring her back, right?" He met her eyes for a brief second. "I'll try." It was the only promise he was willing to make. Then he mounted his horse and rode. No hesitation. No second thoughts. The tracks were easy to follow. 5 horses moving at a steady pace. Not rushing, not worried. They didn't expect to be followed. Ethan leaned low over the saddle, studying the ground as he rode. The prints were fresh, the spacing uneven. One of the horses carried extra weight. Lucia. The sun dipped lower as he moved west, the light turning from harsh gold to deep orange. Shadows stretched long across the land, swallowing details. He pushed harder. By the time he saw the faint glow of firelight ahead, night had already begun to settle. He slowed, guiding his horse behind a rise in the land. From there, he dismounted and moved forward on foot. Carefully, silently. From behind a large rock, he looked down into the small canyon below. The camp was simple. 5 men sat around a fire, laughing, drinking their weapons within reach, but not in hand. Their horses were tied off to one side, and Lucia, she, was tied to a tree, her hands bound behind her back. But her posture was straight. Her head was high. Even now, she didn't look broken. Ethan studied the scene. 5 men, open ground, no cover. A direct attack would be suicide. He waited. Time passed, slowly measured in the shifting of firelight and the rhythm of voices below. One man stood, walked away, returned. Another leaned back, stretching. Patterns, weaknesses. When the night deepened and the shadows thickened, he moved. He circled wide, keeping low, using the terrain to hide his approach. The horses came first. He reached them without being seen. One by one, he cut their ropes, keeping his movements slow and controlled. He patted their sides, guiding them gently away from the camp. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he threw a stone far into the darkness on the opposite side of the canyon. It struck hard. The sound echoed. "What was that?" one of the men shouted. "Go check it out," another barked. 3 of them moved toward the noise. 2 remained. That was enough. Ethan moved, fast. The first man and never saw him coming. A sharp blow from the rifle butt dropped him instantly. The second turned, reaching for his weapon, but Ethan was already on him. A punch quick and precise, followed by another. The man went down hard. The others realized too late. By the time they returned, Ethan was already in motion. He grabbed Lucia, cutting the rope at her wrists. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded. "I knew you would come." He didn't respond. There wasn't time. The remaining men charged. Ethan met them head on. The fight was short, brutal, efficient. A rope looped around one man's legs, sent him crashing to the ground. Another lunged with a knife. Ethan kicked his hand, sending the blade spinning away, before striking him down. In less than a minute, it was over. All 5 men lay bound. Lucia watched him, something like pride in her eyes. "You fight like a man who's been alone too long," she said. Ethan ignored that, helping her onto his horse. They left the camp behind, disappearing into the night. They had gone some distance when it happened. A gunshot. Wild. Unaimed. One of the men must have come to just long enough to fire blindly. The bullet tore across Ethan's shoulder. He flinched, his grip tightening on the reins, but he didn't stop. Blood soaked into his shirt. Lucia saw it. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he said. It wasn't nothing. But it wasn't enough to slow him down. They rode on. The wind was cooler now, the night stretching wide and quiet around them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Lucia's voice came calm and certain. "You always do this, don't you?" He didn't answer. "You save people." She continued. "Not because you expect anything, not because you have to." Silence. She looked at him carefully. "You do it because no one ever saved you." The words landed harder than any blow. Ethan kept his eyes forward, his expression unchanged. He didn't argue. He didn't deny it, because somewhere deep down, he knew she was right. The morning came quietly, as if the land itself had decided to rest. Ethan stood by the fence line, tightening the last length of wire he had been working on since dawn. The air was still the kind of calm that settled over the plains after days of steady wind. His hands moved with practiced ease, pulling, fastening, checking each post, with the same quiet focus he brought to everything. It was just another morning, until it wasn't. A faint trail of dust appeared along the distant road. At first, he barely noticed it. Travelers passed from time to time, traders, ranchers, the occasional drifter. Nothing unusual. But something about the way the dust moved caught his attention. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't uncertain. It was steady, controlled, intentional. He straightened, slowly narrowing his eyes as he looked toward the horizon. 3 riders emerged from the haze, their silhouettes cutting through the rising sunlight. They rode upright, balanced as if the land beneath them belonged to them, just as much as it did to the wind. As they came closer, details sharpened. Beaded patterns shimmered along their garments, catching the light in flashes of color. Feathers shifted gently with each movement of the horses, marking them not just as travelers, but as something more, something rooted, something deliberate. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Not recognition, not yet, but something close to it. He took a step forward as the riders slowed, then came to a stop just outside the fence. They dismounted in silence, and in that moment, time folded in on itself. He knew them. Not by their faces alone, those had changed, grown stronger, sharper with the years, but by something deeper. Something carried in the way they stood, in the way they looked at him. Ayanna, Kiona, Nayeli. He hadn't spoken their names in 10 years. He wasn't even sure he had ever truly known them. Yet, here they were. No introductions were needed. No explanations. The past stood between them as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Ayanna stepped forward. "You remember," she said softly. Ethan let out a slow breath. "Yeah," he replied. "I do." But they weren't the same women he had left behind in the Badlands, not even close. Ayanna stood with a calm that felt unshakable, her presence steady and grounded. There was a depth in her gaze now, something earned through years he hadn't witnessed. Kiona moved differently, every step deliberate, balanced, like someone who had learned to fight and survive, not just once, but many times. There was strength in her posture, a quiet readiness that never fully left her. And Nael. She carried a gentleness that hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. There was clarity in her eyes now, a sharpness that suggested she had seen more than she once had. There was no fear left in any of them, and that was what struck him the most. They weren't here because they needed saving. They were here because they chose to be. "We've been looking for you," Kiona said. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. For 10 years, Nayeli nodded. "We asked in every place we passed. Traders, ranchers, anyone who might have seen a man who rides alone and keeps his distance." Ayanna added, "We heard stories. A man who helped where he could, then disappeared again. A man who didn't stay long enough to belong anywhere." Ethan gave a faint, humorless smile. "Sounds like a lot of men." "Not like you," she said. That made him pause. They spoke of the Badlands, as if it had happened yesterday, the heat that chased the moment in the narrow pass, where death had been close enough to touch. They remembered details he had long since pushed aside. Ethan listened in silence, something uneasy settling in his chest. He had thought that day had passed, that it had meant less. But to them, it hadn't. It had stayed, and somehow so had he. "What about you?" he asked finally. 10 years is a long time." They exchanged glances, as if deciding who would speak first. Ayanna did. "I stayed," she said, "with my people. I learned to heal plants, medicine, the things our elders teach. I help others now." Kiona shrugged lightly. "I didn't stay in one place. I rode with warriors. Protected land that needed protecting. Still do." Nayeli smiled faintly. "I left, traveled, learned craft stories, traded what I could. People listen when you carry something real. 3 lives, 3 paths, all different, all leading back here." Ethan didn't know what to do with that. They opened their bags, then pulling out carefully wrapped items, woven blankets, silver bracelets, strands of beads, small bundles of herbs tied with twine. "These are for you," Nayeli said. Ethan shook his head immediately. "I didn't do it for anything." Ayanna met his gaze. "We know." "It's not payment," Kiona added. Nayeli's voice softened. "It's memory." The word hung in the air. Ethan hesitated, then took the item slowly, unsure what to say. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just heavy. Then Ayanna stepped forward again. "There's something else," she said. Ethan glanced up, expecting perhaps a farewell or a final word to close what had begun 10 years ago. "We have carried something for 10 years, she continued. He nodded slightly, waiting. "And then, we want to marry you." The world didn't stop, but it felt like it did. The wind moved through the grass. A horse shifted its weight. Somewhere in the distance, a bird cried out. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Ethan blinked once, then let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "You're joking." No one smiled. No one moved. They were completely serious. His expression faltered. "You're not..." He stopped, searching their faces. Nothing. No hesitation. No doubt. "You're not joking," he finished. Ayanna shook her head. Ethan ran a hand over the back of his neck, suddenly unsure where to look. "That's not how this works." "It is for us," Kiona said simply. "Why?" he asked. The question came out sharper than he intended. But they didn't flinch. Kiona answered first. "Because you didn't run," she said. "You saw danger and you rode toward it. Not many people do that." Nayeli stepped closer. "Because you asked for nothing. You helped us, and then you left. No claim, no demand." Ayanna's voice was quieter. "Because when everything was chaos, you brought calm. 3 reasons, 3 truths, each one different, each one real." Ethan felt something tightening inside him. Not pride, not gratitude. Pressure. "I'm not that man anymore," he said. "Maybe not," Ayanna replied. "But we are not the same women either." That left him with nothing to say. "Stay," he said finally. "A few days. Let me think." It wasn't an answer, but it wasn't a refusal. They agreed. And from the moment they stepped into his home, everything changed. Nayeli hung woven cloth over the windows, softening the harsh light that used to fill the room. Ayanna cleared a patch of earth behind the cabin and began planting herbs. Kiona worked alongside Ethan in the fields, handling horses with a confidence that even he respected. The silence in the house disappeared, replaced by voices, laughter, movement. Ethan found himself sitting at the table with others, listening instead of eating alone, watching instead of avoiding. It felt unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. That was the part that unsettled him. One night he sat outside, staring into the dark horizon. For years he had feared loneliness. Now he feared something else. Losing this. Losing them. The realization hit harder than any bullet ever had. Days later, the sky changed. A strange yellow tint spread across the horizon, thick and unnatural. The horses grew restless, shifting, snorting. Ethan saw it immediately. "Storm," he muttered. "Not rain. Sand." "And then Rosa," he said under his breath. She had gone out earlier that afternoon. He didn't wait. He was already moving before anyone else spoke. Kiona was right behind him. They rode into the storm as it hit. The wind roared like something alive, sand tearing across the land in violent waves. It stung the skin, filled the air, made it nearly impossible to see. They pushed forward anyway. Rosa, Ethan shouted, his voice swallowed by the wind. They found her clinging to a low bush, her small body shaking against the force of the storm. Ethan jumped down, pulling her close. "I've got you," he said. Kiona positioned herself between them, and the worst of the wind, guiding the horses, creating what little shelter she could. They dropped into a shallow dip in the land, crouching low as the storm raged above them, and in the middle of that chaos, Kiona turned to him. "You don't fear death," she shouted. Ethan didn't respond. "You fear loving someone enough to lose them," and the words cut through everything, through the wind, through the noise, through him. He said nothing, but he heard it. When they returned, the storm passed, but something had shifted. The air inside the house felt different, heavier, more honest. That night, Nayeli found him alone. "I need to say something," she said. He nodded. "I think I loved the man you were," she admitted. "The one who didn't hesitate, the one who didn't think." She looked at him carefully. "I don't know if I know you now." Ethan swallowed. "Neither do I," he said quietly. Later, Ayanna spoke to him as well. "I didn't stay with you in that canyon because I had to," she said. He looked at her. "I chose you," she continued. "From that moment." Her voice didn't waver. "You were never just someone who saved me." Ethan felt the weight of that settle into him. 3 women, 3 truths, 3 different kinds of love. And for the first time in his life, he understood something clearly. He couldn't carry all of them the same way. Love wasn't something you could divide evenly. And whatever choice he made, it would change everything. This time there would be no riding away, no silence, no escape. Ethan did not sleep that night. He sat on the wooden steps outside his cabin, set the lantern beside him unlit, letting the darkness settle naturally around him. The wind had calmed after the storm, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost too quiet, as if the land itself was waiting for something to be decided. He replayed everything. Kiona's voice cutting through the storm, Nayeli's quiet confession, Ayanna's steady, unwavering gaze. For years he had lived by instinct, act when needed, walk away when it was over, never stay long enough for anything to matter too much. But this was different. There was no fight to win, no enemy to outmaneuver, no clear path forward, only a question. What did he want? Not who deserved him more, not who had suffered more, not who had waited longer, but what he was willing to live with, what he was willing to risk. Because for the first time in his life, he understood something clearly. Choosing someone meant choosing the possibility of losing them. And he had spent years avoiding exactly that. The sky began to lighten slowly, the first pale shades of morning stretching across the horizon. When the sun finally rose, casting gold across the fields, Ethan stood. He had his answer. Not the kind anyone expected, but it was his. He found Nayeli first. She was sitting on the porch just as she often did in the mornings, small beads scattered across a cloth in front of her. Her hands moved with quiet precision, threading colors together into patterns that told stories he didn't fully understand, but somehow still felt. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. "You didn't sleep," she said. "No," he admitted. She set the beads aside gently. "Then say what you came to say." Ethan exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "You deserve the truth," he began, "not something shaped by memory or by what we think we owe each other." She didn't interrupt. "You deserve a man who loves you for who you are now." He continued, his voice steady, "not who you remind him of." A flicker of pain passed through her eyes, but it didn't turn into anger. "I'm not the man I was 10 years ago," he said. "Back then, I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I just acted. But that man doesn't exist anymore." Nayeli nodded slowly, absorbing every word. "I know," she said softly. That surprised him. She gave a small, almost sad smile. "I think I've known for a while." I held on to him anyway. Ethan lowered his gaze. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she replied. "Memories are easy to love. They don't change. People do." She stood then, stepping closer, not as someone holding on to something, but as someone letting go. "I don't want a life built on something that's already gone," she said. "I want something real." He met her eyes. "That's what you deserve." They stood there for a moment, the silence between them no longer heavy, but resolved. No bitterness, no blame, just understanding. He found Kiona next. She was in the field working with one of the younger horses, guiding it through controlled movements, her posture firm, her focus absolute. The horse responded to her with trust, even in its uncertainty. She noticed him before he spoke. "You're here to say goodbye," she said. Ethan gave a faint, almost rueful smile. "You always did see things straight?" She shrugged. "No point pretending." He stepped closer, resting his hands lightly on the fence. "You don't belong here," he said. Kiona raised an eyebrow slightly. "That so? You were never meant to be tied to fences," he continued. "You belong out there." He nodded toward the open horizon, riding, moving, choosing your own direction. Her gaze followed his for a moment, then returned to him. "I always wondered if you understood that," she said. "I didn't. Not back then," he admitted. "But I do now." He took a breath. "I can't be the man who rides beside you forever. I'm not built for that life. And you shouldn't have to change who you are to stay." Kiona studied him for a long moment. Then slowly she smiled. Not brightly, not happily, but with something deeper acceptance. "I didn't love you because I thought you would follow me," she said. "I loved you because you did what was right, even when it cost you something." Ethan felt that settle into him. "You're still doing that now," she added. He shook his head slightly. "This doesn't feel right." "Doesn't have to," she replied. "It just has to be true." She stepped back, releasing the horse, letting it move freely again. "I won't stay where I don't belong," she said. "And I won't ask you to become someone you're not." There was no sadness in her voice, only certainty. They didn't say goodbye then. They didn't need to. He found Ayanna last. She was behind the house in the small garden she had built over the past weeks. The scent of herbs lingered in the air, grounding steady like her. She didn't turn when he approached. "I wondered how long it would take," she said. Ethan stopped a few steps behind her. "I don't have an answer for you," he said. Ayanna finally turned, her expression calm. "I know." He frowned slightly. "You do. You're not ready," she said simply. The words weren't an accusation, just truth, loving you. He began, then paused, searching for the right way to say it. "Loving you would mean letting go of fear. And I haven't done that yet." Ayanna nodded. "I don't want an answer that comes from fear," she said, "or from pressure, or from the idea that you have to choose." He looked at her, something tightening in his chest. "Then, what do you want?" She held his gaze steadily. "A real answer," she said, "when you're ready to give it. No demand, no expectation, just patience." That unsettled him more than anything else. That evening he gathered all three of them. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the land, turning everything gold and quiet. They stood together in front of him, waiting. Ethan took a breath. "I can't marry any of you," he said. The words hung in the air, heavy, final. No one spoke, no one cried. There was no anger, no accusations, just silence. He continued, his voice steady despite the weight of it. "You deserve someone who isn't afraid," he said. "Someone who doesn't hesitate when it comes to loving you fully." He looked at each of them in turn. "I won't marry you out of gratitude," he said, "or because I'm afraid of being alone." The truth felt raw, unprotected. "I need time," he admitted, "to become someone who can choose without fear." For a moment the world seemed to pause. Then Ayanna nodded. Kiona exhaled quietly. Nayeli lowered her gaze, and somehow That was enough. Kiona left before dawn the next morning. Ethan watched from a distance as she mounted her horse, her movements sure, her posture unbroken. She didn't look back as she rode west, disappearing into the open land where she belonged. Nayeli stayed a few days longer. She packed her things slowly, carefully, as if closing one chapter and preparing for another. When she finally left, she embraced Ayanna first, then Ethan. "Take care of what you choose," she said softly. "I will," he replied. She smiled faintly, then turned and walked her own path. No promises, no illusions, just acceptance. Ayanna stayed, not as someone waiting, not as someone hoping, just as herself. She worked in the garden, tended the land, spoke when there was something to say, and stayed silent when there wasn't. She didn't bring up the future, didn't ask questions, didn't push. And slowly over time, something in Ethan began to change. It wasn't sudden. It didn't come in a single moment. It happened in small ways. He started accepting the Martinez family's invitations instead of declining them. He stayed longer at their table, listening, even speaking more than he used to. He told Rosa stories not just of the land, but of himself. He worked alongside Ayanna, learning the names of plants, the rhythm of something that wasn't just survival. He spoke when something mattered. He didn't turn away when things became uncomfortable. And one evening, sitting outside with a fading light stretching across the fields, he realized something. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the future, not of loss, not of what could go wrong. Because he understood now, loving someone didn't protect you from pain. It meant accepting it, choosing it. A year passed. The land looked the same golden grass, the same endless horizon. But Ethan was not the same man standing in it. He found Ayanna in the garden. She was kneeling in the dirt, her hands moving gently through the soil. He walked toward her without hesitation. "Ayanna." She looked up. There was no surprise in her eyes, just quiet awareness. "I'm ready," he said. She stood slowly. For what he met her gaze, for the answer I couldn't give before. He stepped closer. "I'm not afraid anymore," he said. "Not of losing you, not of what comes after." His voice didn't waver. "If loving you means risking pain, I choose it." Ayanna watched him carefully, not searching, not questioning, just listening. Then she smiled, soft, certain. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a simple silver chain. No gemstone, no grand display, just something real. He lowered himself onto one knee right there in the dirt, in the place where life had quietly grown between them. "Will you marry me?" He said, his voice steady, not because of what we were, but because of what we choose now. Ayanna's eyes filled with tears. She nodded. Yes. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was everything. They were married in the open field not long after. The Martinez family stood with them, laughter and warmth filling the space that had once been defined by silence. There were no grand speeches, no elaborate ceremony. Just two people who had learned in their own time how to choose each other. Ethan stood there, no longer the man who rode away from everything, and Ayanna stood beside him, no longer the girl running from danger. They weren't saved. They weren't rescued. They had simply chosen. And this time, he didn't turn away. Life after marriage did not arrive with thunder. It came quietly, the way most true things do. Ethan and Ayanna settled into a rhythm that felt almost fragile in its peace, as if both of them understood how rare such a life was, and handled it carefully because of that. Mornings began before sunrise. Ethan would step outside first sometimes to feed the horses, sometimes just to stand in the cool gray light and listen to the world waking up. Ayanna would join him soon after wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, her hair still loose from sleep. They rarely spoke much at that hour. They did not need to. Their silence had changed. It no longer meant distance. It meant ease. They repaired fences side by side. They carried water from the well together. Ayanna worked in her herb garden, while Ethan mended tools nearby. And by noon, they would meet in the shade of the porch to eat simple meals and watch the wind move through the tall grass. In the evenings, they cooked together in the warm glow of the cabin. She chopped herbs while he stirred stew. Sometimes she laughed softly at the way he measured nothing, and still somehow got the flavor right. Sometimes he would look up from the fire and catch her watching him with that same steady gaze that had once unnerved him and now made him feel seen. It was a good life. Not loud, not dramatic, but full. And yet, even inside that fullness, traces of the old Ethan remained. There were still moments when he went quiet for too long. Moments when Ayanna would ask him a question, and he would seem to hear it from very far away. Sometimes he stood at the window after dark, looking out as if he expected something to come riding over the hills. He smiled more now. He touched her more easily. He had learned to share his thoughts more than before. But some part of him still held back at the edge, as though complete peace might vanish if he trusted it too much. Ayanna noticed, though, she did not press. Then the first signs appeared. At first they were small enough to dismiss. Ayanna tired more easily in the afternoons. Once, while kneeling in the herb garden, she had to sit back abruptly and press a hand to her temple. Another day she rose from the table too fast and stopped gripping the chair until the room steadied around her. Ethan noticed, but only in the practical way. He noticed everything. "You've been working too hard," he said one evening as he poured water into a cup and handed it to her. Ayanna gave him a faint smile. "So have you. That's different. It always is with you." She drank the water and said nothing more, and Ethan let himself believe it was only fatigue. The harvest season had been busy. The days were hot. The work had been heavier than usual. Then one morning, she did not get out of bed. He woke before dawn as always, but when he returned from the barn, the cabin was still quiet. Too quiet. He set down the bucket he was carrying and stepped into their room. Ayanna was awake but pale. One hand rested across her stomach. The other gripped the edge of the blanket. "Ayanna." She looked at him and tried to sit up. The effort alone made her breath catch. Ethan crossed the room in 2 strides. "What's wrong?" She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "I feel weak." The words were simple, but they struck him harder than they should have. For the first time in a long while, real fear touched him before he had time to push it away. He knelt beside the bed. "Did you hurt yourself?" She shook her head. "No." "Are you sick?" "I don't think so." His mind moved quickly through everything he knew, which was not enough. Too much work. Heat, bad water, fever, a hidden injury. He hated not knowing. Hated it with a force that rose too fast inside his chest. Ayanna looked at him then, and something shifted in her expression. A calm understanding, as if she had reached a thought before he had. Slowly, she placed his hand over hers where it rested on her stomach. Ethan frowned. She watched his face carefully. "I think," she said, "we are not alone anymore." He stared at her. The room seemed to lose all sound. No creaking wood, no wind, no distant horses. Just the quiet between one heartbeat and the next. "You mean?" Ayanna nodded once. He looked down at her stomach as if he might somehow see through skin and fabric into the future itself. Then he looked back at her, but no words came. His mouth parted, closed, opened again, and still nothing. Carefully, almost reverently, he let his hand settle there. The gesture lasted only a moment. The silence after it lasted much longer. Joy rose first, raw and startling. It hit him like sunlight, breaking through cloud too sudden to be doubted. But fear came with it close behind, not as an opposite feeling, but as its shadow. Ayanna read both on his face. "You don't have to be afraid of happiness," she said softly. He swallowed. "That's not what I'm afraid of." But he did not yet know how to explain the rest. In the days that followed, Ethan changed. At first, the change looked like care. He would not let Ayanna lift water buckets. He insisted on repairing every loose board before she noticed it. He hovered when she walked down the porch steps, as if the earth itself might fail beneath her. Then the care sharpened. If she went into the garden, he found a reason to follow. If she rode to visit the Martinez family, he rode beside her. If she bent to reach for something, he was there before her hand touched it. He checked the food twice, the well twice, the horses twice. He watched the weather with a concentration that bordered on obsession. He told himself he was protecting her. But deep down, he knew what it really was. He was trying to bargain with fate, trying to control every small danger before it had a chance to grow teeth. One afternoon, Ayanna straightened from the herb bed with dirt on her hands and looked at him where he stood only a few feet away, pretending to fix a saddle strap he had already repaired that morning. "Ethan." He didn't look up. But she wiped her hands on her skirt. "Are you trying to protect us?" He finally raised his eyes. "Or control everything because you're afraid?" The question landed with unnerving precision. His first reaction was instinctive defensive. "I'm making sure you're safe." Ayanna held his gaze. "Safety isn't the same as living." He bristled. "You think I don't know that I think you know it," she said. "But you don't trust it." He looked away, jaw tightening. She stepped closer, not angry, only honest. "I am carrying your child. I understand fear, but if you let fear decide everything, then it will raise this family before love ever gets the chance." He had no answer for that. The tension between them did not explode into shouting. It did not need to. It remained in the air, afterward quiet and undeniable, following them through the next few days like a shadow just beyond direct sight. And the old fear came back. Not as a memory, as a living thing. At night, Ethan lay awake, listening to Ayanna breathe beside him. Sometimes he would turn and watch her in the dark, counting the rise and fall of her chest. The memories he had spent years burying returned with cruel clarity. His mother burning with fever. His father gone too soon after. The woman who had walked away because he had been too afraid to build a future with her. Loss had always come in silence, never with warning loud enough to stop it. And now it wasn't just one person he could lose. It was everything. Ayanna. The child. The fragile, hard-won family he had only just learned to hold. Sleep became difficult. Then rare. He moved through his days with a tightness in his shoulders that never left. The breaking point came on an ordinary afternoon. The sky was clear, the wind mild. Nothing about the day announced danger. Ayanna had gone a short distance from the cabin to gather a plant that only grew near a patch of low stones beyond the creek. Ethan had been in the barn repairing a harness. When he realized she had been gone longer than expected, something cold moved through him. He left the harness where it lay and went looking. He found her near the stones. She was on the ground, not fallen badly, not twisted or bleeding, just collapsed in the grass, one hand braced weakly against the earth as if she had tried to catch herself before the world had gone dark. For one terrible second, Ethan stopped breathing. Ayanna. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as they reached for her face, her shoulders searching for injury, for blood, for anything he could fight. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice. "I'm here," he said too quickly, too loudly. "I'm here." She blinked confused for a moment, then tried to sit up. He stopped her immediately. No, don't move. I only got dizzy now. The word came out harsher than he meant it to. Panic had already taken hold, full and merciless. He lifted her into his arms and carried her back to the cabin, as if the distance itself were dangerous. He barely remembered the walk, only the pounding in his chest, only the thought, brutal and immediate, not her, not them, not now. Once inside, he laid her carefully on the bed. Ayanna caught his wrist before he could pull away. Ethan. He could not look at her. Look at me. He did. There were tears in his eyes before he even realized it, and that, more than anything, made the truth impossible to avoid. He had not conquered his fear. He had only dressed it in the language of devotion and called it care. Ayanna's voice was quiet, but it did not waver. You can't love us halfway just to feel safe. The words struck deep because they were true. He sat outside again that night on the same porch where he had once chosen honesty over escape. The darkness stretched around him. The same land, the same stars, the same man, and yet not the same at all. The difference was this. This time he did not think about running. He did not tell himself he was better off alone. He did not imagine disappearing into the open country before love could become loss. He sat with the fear. Actually sat with it, examined it. And at last, he understood something he should have learned long ago. Love was never meant to remove fear. It demanded that you feel it fully and remain anyway. If he wanted to keep this family, really keep it, then he could not keep reaching for control every time fear whispered in his ear. He would have to trust. Trust Ayanna. Trust life. Trust that being unable to control everything did not mean he was doomed to lose it all. That realization did not bring peace immediately. But it brought direction. Months passed. Ayanna's belly grew rounder, her movements slower and more deliberate. The ranch shifted around the coming child. Ethan repaired the cradle 3 separate times, though it had never once been broken. He stocked more supplies than they could possibly need. He tried consciously now to hold back when fear told him to hover. Sometimes he succeeded. Sometimes he did not. But Ayanna saw the effort, and that mattered. As the time drew near, the air inside the cabin changed. Even laughter sounded softer, as if everyone understood they stood on the edge of something enormous. There was no doctor nearby, no town close enough to matter if things went wrong quickly. The nearest help was far, and the roads were uncertain. Ethan knew all of this. He said little about it. But Ayanna could see it in the way he checked the horses at dusk, in the way he paused at the doorway, before going to sleep, in the way his hands lingered on the back of her chair at supper. Then labor began. It started before dawn, with a pain that bent Ayanna over and stole the breath from her lungs. At first, she tried to hide it, but the second wave left no room for pride. Ethan was beside her before she could call his name. The hours that followed were unlike anything he had ever faced. There was no enemy to fight, no physical threat he could meet with speed or force. Only pain, long relentless, beyond his reach. Ayanna's face grew pale, then flushed, then pale again. Sweat soaked her hairline. Her hands gripped the blanket hard enough to whiten the knuckles. Ethan did everything she asked. Water, blankets, fire. More light, less light, silence, presence. And none of it felt like enough. He had spent his life surviving action. This was something else entirely. This was helplessness. The labor dragged on. Too long, Ayanna's strength began to thin, and for the first time in many years, Ethan felt truly powerless. He made the decision in a single breath. I'm going for help. Ayanna caught his sleeve weakly. Who he already knew. There were only 2 people in the world he trusted with this kind of need. Only 2 women whose names had once stood beside his at the center of an impossible choice. He saddled the fastest horse and rode hard. By late afternoon, he found Kiona first, exactly where rumor and instinct said he might in the western grasslands, leading a small patrol. She saw his face before he spoke and was already moving toward him when he dismounted. "I need help," he said. "Not for me." He didn't have to say the rest. Kiona's expression sharpened. "Ayana," he nodded. Together, they rode for Nayeli, who had settled farther south, known now, not just for her craft, but for the old healing knowledge she had gathered along the way. When Ethan reached her breathless and dust-covered, she took one look at him and set down everything in her hands. "I need help," he said again, his voice rough. "Not for me." Nayeli's face softened, and without hesitation, she began gathering what she needed. The three of them rode back through deepening light. It felt strangely like fate, completing a circle. 10 years ago, he had ridden toward 3 women in danger. Now 2 of those women rode back with him to save the life he had built. When they reached the ranch, the sky had darkened. Wind was rising again, not yet a storm, but enough to make the world feel unsettled. Kiona moved first, securing the horses, checking the perimeter, preparing for whatever the night might bring. Nayeli went straight inside. What followed tested all of them. Ayana was exhausted, but she fought with a strength Ethan had always admired and never fully understood. Nayeli guided her with calm authority, her voice steady, practical, kind. Kiona remained just outside when she was not needed, guarding the quiet of the house like a warrior guards sacred ground. Then the wind strengthened. Shutters rattled. The lamp flame bent and shivered. The cabin seemed to draw inward around the strain of the night. At one point, Ethan stood in the doorway between the 2 rooms, hands clenched so tightly they hurt, while Ayana cried out from the bed, and Nayeli worked with unwavering focus beside her. Everything in him wanted to do something, to fix, to command, to fight. But there was nothing left for him to control. Only trust in Ayana's strength, trust in Nayeli's skill, trust in the women who had once stood in a canyon beside him and were now standing here again, not as unfinished love stories, but as part of the life that had shaped him. For the first time, he truly let go, not of love, of control. And then at last, oh cry. Sharp, thin, new. The sound cut through the whole house and shattered the tension at its center. For a moment, Ethan did not move. He simply stood there, stunned, as if his body needed time to understand what his heart already had. Then he stepped forward. Nayeli looked up, tired but smiling, and placed the child in his arms. Ethan stared down at the tiny face, at the impossibly small hands, at the life that existed, because he had once chosen not to run and then years later chosen not to hide. He expected fear. Instead, what came was something cleaner, deeper, wonder. His throat tightened. He looked at Ayana, pale and exhausted, but alive, and the relief that moved through him was so powerful, he had to steady himself before speaking. "She's beautiful," he whispered. Ayana smiled faintly. "You don't even know if it's a girl?" He almost laughed through the tears in his eyes. Then he looked around the room, at Ayana, at Nayeli, at Kiona in the doorway, silent and watchful. And he understood with a clarity that would stay with him for the rest of his life, that they had never simply been choices he did or did not make. They were part of the road that had led him here. The women who had once asked him to marry them had in the end given him something greater than a decision. They had helped him become a man capable of love without fear. Morning came soft and pale over the ranch. The wind had died. The land looked washed clean. Kiona saddled her horse first. Ethan stepped outside with the child in his arms, while Ayana rested inside. Kiona adjusted the reins, then looked at him for a long moment. You don't need me to fight for you anymore, she said. Ethan nodded, emotion tightening his chest. No, he said, but I'll always be grateful you did. She smiled once, brief and fierce, then rode west without regret. Nayeli left later, after checking on Ayanna one last time and wrapping the baby in a soft, woven blanket of her own making. At the door, she turned back, her eyes warm. Now you have your own story to tell, she said. Ethan looked down at the child, then back at her. Part of it will always be yours. She inclined her head, accepting that, and walked into the morning light. By noon, the ranch was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet now. Ethan stood outside the cabin, the baby cradled securely in his arms. Ayanna came to stand beside him, leaning lightly into his shoulder. Together, they looked out across the fields, where the grass moved under the sun, just as it had 10 years ago, just as it would long after they were gone. A new life had begun, not because fear had vanished, but because love had stayed. Ethan pressed a kiss to the top of Ayanna's head, and then looked down at the child sleeping against his chest. 10 years ago, he had saved 3 lives. He never knew they would return to save his. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. Your support means more than you know. If this journey moved you even a little, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you more stories like this.